Hi everybody, we are Group C, and today we're going to talk to you a little bit about Chapter 5, which deals with critical information that's missing or data that's difficult to collect. In general, data constraints. And so Bamberger and colleagues in our textbook tell us that evaluators often face these constraints in the real world of evaluation practice. And so sometimes there's limited availability of data, the data is not accurate, and as evaluators, we have to figure out what to do in those situations. So there's some various reasons why data might not be available, why baseline data might not be available. Perhaps the organization that has the project or the program, they don't understand that baseline data is important, and so it was never collected. Perhaps there aren't the funds to spend on collecting baseline data, or there weren't the funds when the project was conceived. There might not be organizational mechanisms in place to collect and analyze data, and so that could be infrastructure, there might not be the human resources, or those human resources may not have the skills to collect and analyze data. There might be an army of volunteers, but they don't have the level of literacy needed for the type of baseline data that you need, and you have to adjust your expectations or adjust your methods. Sometimes when new projects are formed, it takes time to get all of the funding, hire all of the people, and then start a system for collecting that baseline data, and that's not always realistic in the way that organizations are formed. Sometimes organizations come out of activities that necessitate an organization. I'm thinking about the organization that I worked for when I was in the Peace Corps. A woman had started doing rape and domestic violence support, and then people started giving her money in order to start an organization. And so, of course, there was never any kind of baseline data that was collected about those victims and survivors. There might be poor coordination between the data collectors and the evaluators. Information might not be collected and filed as required. You might have a lot of paper data that has very poor penmanship on it, and so you're not even quite sure what you're dealing with. And there might be omitted variables. And so these omitted variables is information that wasn't included, variables that weren't included in the baseline survey, and that you find that you really need. So we're going to talk about some different strategies for reconstructing baseline data. One is using administrative data, and this is administrative data from the organization, the project, or the program that you're working with. This can include planning studies that were implemented before the project or the program started. It could be monitoring reports that have come over time for the project or the program. Any kind of administrative records, documentation of how many people attended programs, of who was served by these programs. And so sometimes you don't have this data, but also sometimes you don't have this data in a format that's really convenient. So as I was mentioning before, you might have pages and pages and pages of clinical data that are just really difficult to read, or that aren't organized in chronological order, and that you actually have to go back in and either decide, am I going to take the many, many hours it will take to organize this, or am I just going to try to reconstruct that data some other way? You can also use secondary data. This includes censuses, surveys that have been conducted by other organizations or from people outside of the organization. A lot of times, if you're in a resource-poor country, there might be lots of organizations operating in the area, NGOs, NPOs, missionaries, and you might be able to get some data that they have collected. Community records, as I mentioned, religious institutions, missionaries can be a really good way to find this data. And if there have been missionaries in the past, you might be able to actually find them in their original countries if they came from another country, and then get that data from them. And then many cultures are self-documenting. And a really good example that I thought of was that Amanda Viley in anthropology and I were working on a qualitative research project about midwifery, particularly related to maternal health and maternal deaths. And in the Maya village that we work in the Yucatan Peninsula, a lot of times when people have died, we are able to go to their family members, we're able to go to community members and get information from those community members that has been passed down in oral history. So we might want information about how many women died 50 years ago, and we have two generations that came from the midwives who operated in that village, and we're able to interview them, and they actually remember these stories that their grandparents, great grandparents have told them. Now, oral history can sometimes be difficult to verify as factual, as quantitatively factual, as qualitatively factual. And so one of the ways that we make sure that this is reliable and valid information is that we triangulate. And so we try to find documentation that matches those interviews, that matches key informant interviews, that matches community member interviews versus, for example, news articles. And we try to see, are they all in keeping with each other? Are they copacetic in some way? So another strategy is conducting retrospective surveys. And so you can go to people and ask them, 2 years ago, how much do you think that you spent on maize every week? And collect data that way. They can have bias, but you can also ask them to refer to other documentation they might have. So they might have calendars or time diaries. And really, we're getting to the point where in so many places, even really remote places, people have cell phones. And if their cell phones have been a cell phone that they've used for 2 to 3 years, they might actually have some useful data that they have maintained in that device for a certain amount of time that you need. Another strategy is participatory evaluation methods, or PRA, participatory rural appraisal. And PRA developed out of a reaction to top-down planning, which was that development, quote, experts from resource-heavy countries would come into resource-poor countries, or what can also be referred to as developing countries, and say, we see what you need the same things that we need, or you need the things that we think that you need in your community. PRA involves getting communities involved to identify problems, to identify solutions, and to figure out what that community needs per their own recommendations. And this is something that's widely used. I have used this in community mapping, for example. Trying to figure out HIV and AIDS deaths can often be very difficult because a lot of times, for example, in South Africa, people attribute HIV/AIDS deaths to cancer, to accidents, to other sorts of things. But if you really talk to people and get information about what they know, what the symptoms were, you can reconstruct public health data even if the thing that was reported previously wasn't exactly accurate. Working with key informants can be another strategy. Community leaders, doctors, teachers, government agencies, NGOs, religious organizations. It's just really important to remember that when you're working with key informants, that you're both working with these folks who appear to be experts, for example, chiefs, council people, but that you're also talking to people who don't have an official title, or who don't seem like they would be the most important person in a village, in a town, in an area. And that's one of the ways that you can confirm that data, but also it makes sure that you get the full picture. And then one of our last strategies is using GIS, which is a geographical mapping system that is very user-friendly, and it's very easy for anybody from children to adults to use. And this can be a way to document people's whereabouts, the routes that they take to, for example, the fields where they take to get to work, who spends time at each other's houses, that sort of information. So we're going to talk a little bit about special issues in reconstructing this data, and one is trying to find a comparison group. The text tells us that it can be very difficult to find identical groups. And so one of the reasons is that participants who are utilizing a program often already have attributes that predispose them to successful outcomes. And so the book talks about microfinance, particularly women's microfinance. So you might have a small community where women are involved in a microfinance program, but these are women who, by virtue of being in a community that supports this, might be living in a household where they don't have a lot of gender-based hurdles to cross when it comes to participating in the program. However, in another community that might look demographically very similar, if participation in these types of programs isn't the norm, it could be that these women are not the types of women who are going to sign up for a microfinance program, or who have spouses or parents who wouldn't allow them to sign up for such a program. And so it's important to keep that in mind. It's also important to keep in mind that two communities can look similar, but if they speak a different language or they have a different religion, that it's possible that they have a different orientation towards a project or program, then that needs to be considered. You also might find that you need to address sensitive topics when you're doing monitoring and evaluation. It could be issues of religion, issues of gender, issues of sex, sexual orientation, sex work. And the book gives us 3 strategies in order to sort of deal with this issue. One is to make sure that you have a diversity of informants. So you want to make sure that, for example, if you're interviewing sex workers, that you're not just interviewing the sex workers themselves or their clients, but that maybe you're also interviewing the teachers who teach at the school that's near the district where this happens, or maybe even, if you have permission, children of the women who are participating in sex work. You also want to make sure that you're using culturally appropriate strategies, and we're going to talk about that in a second. And then again, triangulation. Make sure that you can confirm this with other sources. So some culturally appropriate strategies include observation, focus groups, making sure that your focus groups are age and gender specific, using small case studies and using key informants. And for trying to reach those groups, participant observation, I think, is really important, but also participating in the observation. So you don't just want to sit there and look creepy watching people, but to also participate by dancing, going to funerals, going to weddings, integrating in a sense so that you can make those connections. The book talks about tracer studies, where if you're trying to find difficult to locate people, you work with neighbors and friends and family members to locate those people who can give you important information. Snowball sampling is something that's used a lot in qualitative research, where you conduct an interview and then you ask, do you know anyone else who might want to talk to us? And then sociometric techniques, where you construct social networks in order to draw conclusions. And then finally, we get some common threats to adequacy and validity in these evaluations that are related to data constraints. And these are all things that we talked about last week: confirmability and objectivity, reliability and dependability, internal validity, credibility, and authenticity, external validity, transferability, fittingness, threats to statistical conclusion validity, threats to internal validity, threats to construct validity, and threats to external validity. And so again, if we can reiterate one more time, that triangulation is so important when dealing with holes in your data, when dealing with difficult to reach populations, and when dealing with difficult topical information, that if you make sure that you are corroborating experiences through talking to friends and family members, that you're talking to both authorities, but then also looking at secondary data or looking at project data, then hopefully you'll be able to address some of these challenges in a way that makes your evaluation that much stronger. Thank you.